Good evening and welcome to today's webinar. Whether you are joining us live or whether you're watching a recording of this webinar later on YouTube, we are so glad you're here tonight. My name is Amy Gingrich and I'm publisher and executive director at Menno Media and its book imprint Herald Press. And tonight's webinar is called a Common Read. At Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Church Canada and Herald Press are partnering together to encourage every Mennonite to carefully read some books we've chosen to equip the church. And tonight I want to welcome the authors here for our Common Read, Regina Shands Stoltzfus and Tobin Shearer. Their book, Been in the Struggle, Pursuing an Anti-Racist Spirituality, is the focus of our conversation here tonight. Regina was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and she currently lives in Goshen, Indiana. She lived in Cleveland, though, for the first half of her life. She is on the faculty at Goshen College in the Religion, Justice, and Society Department. Regina is co-founder of the Roots of Justice Anti-Oppression Program, formerly Damascus Road Anti-Racism Program, and she has worked widely in peace education. She holds a Master of Arts degree in Biblical Studies from Ashland Theological Seminary and a PhD in Theology and Ethics from Chicago Theological Seminary. She is the author of 2 previous books, and her many articles have appeared in publications such as Sojourners and The Mennonite. She's also written for the Anabaptist Historian's blog. Tobin Shearer is co-founder with Regina of the Damascus Road Anti-Racism Process, now Roots of Justice, and an award-winning professor of history and African American studies at the University of Montana. He is the author of 5 books and more than 100 articles, and his work has appeared in publications including the Chicago Tribune, Conspire, the Mennonite, and Anabaptist Historians. He blogs at Truth and Grace. Tobin is also the co-founder with his wife Cheryl Shearer of the anti-racism training and consulting nonprofit called Wider Stand Consulting. And you certainly, if you've read this book, have read some about Wider Stand and about Roots of Justice. Together, they have written this book called Been in the Struggle. Been in the Struggle nurtures, challenges, and fosters the work and witness of dismantling racism for the long haul. Filled with wisdom and insight from their nearly 3 decades of partnering across racial lines in this work, Tobin and Regina offer a powerful mix of practical direction and poignant reflection to empower and sustain those working and dismantling racism, regardless of their stage on the journey. They draw on the power and promise of interracial relationships to offer a vision for an anti-racist spirituality, which we'll unpack together here tonight. Together, this Black woman and white man address the spirituality of conflict and crisis, embracing Blackness amid an anti-Black culture and the importance of spiritual disciplines in the ongoing work of anti-racism. I know that some joining today have already read Been in the Struggle, and some are joining to decide today if they want to read the book, and all are welcome here. You can buy the book Been in the Struggle directly from Herald Press, and the link will appear in the chat or wherever books are sold. We will take time toward the end of tonight's webinar to answer questions that you have. I invite you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen in Zoom to add your questions, and we'll again get to those after a while in tonight's webinar. So Regina and Tobin, it is so great to have you here today talking about your book.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us, Amy.
Good to be here. This will be fun, I think. Yeah.
I think so too. I want to actually start on page 53, Anti-Racist Spirituality. I think it would be good for us to hear a little bit about what is an anti-racist spirituality. How are you defining that? Because this then is woven throughout your book. So I think this lays the groundwork for the book as well as for our conversation tonight. And I've invited Tobin and Regina to read a paragraph here where they define this. And Regina, I think you'll start.
Yes. All right. From page 53. An anti-racist spirituality is a way of being in the world that draws on the unknown and the unknowable, which some call spirit, others name the divine, goes by the word of mystery, relates to us as God, to encourage, empower, and enthuse amid the intention and the action to undermine the systems of white supremacy around us. It is marked by knowledge of the warp and woof of race-based power, privilege, and oppression.
It fosters truth-telling, first to self and then to others. It lifts up communal efforts, is not afraid of hard conversation, and invites laughter, joy, and human connection. An anti-racist spirituality encourages awareness of limitation while inviting all that has not yet been conceived, gestated, or birthed to move into the possible and be fully realized. It is strong. It does not demand perfection. It does not easily crumble.
Tobin, you mentioned, just as we were gathering here right ahead of this webinar, that this is a paragraph that you really like in the book. Say a little bit more about that and how you decided to center this book that's rooted in your shared experience on an anti-racist spirituality. And Regina, you jump in here too. I'm gonna point to Tobin first, since he said he really liked this paragraph.
Sure.
Yeah, I think part of it's the language. We spent a lot of time together just coming up with language that we felt good about, that expressed the ideas that we both knew we had to talk about. One of the first things that when you, Amy, approached us about the idea of writing this book was that we sort of turned to each other in this virtual space and said, we think we have a book inside us. We've got something to say. And a big part of that was because we didn't know of another book out there that addressed and brought together the work of dismantling racism very intentionally with spiritual formation and a walk that engages that from a spiritual grounding. And so that was, I think, the place where we best capture this centerpiece of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that that paragraph sets us up for what we do in the book, which might be surprising to people based on the title, who might be looking for a list of practices that one can follow. Every morning do this, every evening do this. And we don't go there because we are thinking really concretely about the place of spirituality and what emerges when we allow that to happen, and looking for the movement of the spirit, if I can say that, in the context of the stories that we share, the things that we have learned over a long time of course, working with each other, but working with lots of other people. And it really has been a gift to sort of step back and say, okay, we have learned some things on this journey that I know it's true for me, that help me in the work that I do day to day now, whether it's in the classroom with my students or on our campus or with the groups that we continue to work with. There is a wisdom that we have gained that is not of our own doing. And that is the work of the Spirit.
And I would just add to that we're also, and we talk about this in the book at several points, it was a big part of our weekly conversations as we were composing it, that we're very much aware this book comes not only out of our work together, but out of a collective much broader than the two of us that goes back generations. That's not just even our contemporaries, but those that have spoken to us through their written word, to the historical record, and through the stories that have been passed down to us. It was definitely a book written in amidst a cloud of witnesses.
Yeah, absolutely.
At various points in the book, you talk about how understanding racism has been vastly oversimplified and watered down, and you give some great examples of that. So when that happens in our personal conversations, as you note in the book, or in movies, or in our churches, what do you believe can happen to someone's spirituality, both for Blacks and for whites? What's the danger that you would name of that oversimplification?
One of the things that I would say is the oversimplification leads us to thinking that it's an easy fix. That and it's the paradox of the book, right? Because it is a book that is born out of friendship and working together over the course of 3 decades. But one of the dangers is, well, just go get a friend of another race, and that's the end of racism. And we continue to hear that generation after generation, but we also continue to witness that racism still, it evolves to fit the times that it's in. And so that simplification is very seductive because friendship is powerful, right? But that is one of the
Narrative,
things
yes.
that I see. Mhm.
Another way we talk about that very question in terms of the dangers is we end up confusing the point of relationship with the process of relationship. In other words, the solution that's been suggested in this oversimplified way has been to say, as Regina just said, go get a friend of a different race. That's the point. But what we try to demonstrate in this work is that the point of our work is this very difficult, challenging endeavor of dismantling racism. And in the process of doing that, our relationship developed. That it wasn't the solution itself, it was something that emerged from the work. And that's where we see the most authentic relationships developing, is when there's co-strugglers that are joining this work alongside each other.
You talk about the head knowledge. That I think, just kind of piggybacking here on what you're saying, Tobin, this head knowledge of how white supremacy functions, and the separate challenge of how to face it in our own house. And both of you give great examples throughout the book of how this works. Talk about that intersection, right? But getting back to this friend idea, Regina, that if we have a friend that solves the problem. So talk about, how do we face it in our own house, in our own congregations, in our own systems, that intersection between the head and then the separate challenge of facing it.
Yeah, well, I think that the intersection between the head and the challenges we face, I think in terms of the head and the heart, right? And so friendships are born of the heart. And it seems to me that one of the things that is true is that interracial friendships or other kinds of diverse friendships, people becoming friends across certain boundaries, can be wonderful and are easy as long as, in this case, racism doesn't rear its head, which it probably is going to do so in the case of interracial friendships. It doesn't even have to be an argument or a fight about something. It can be the way that the friends talk about the same phenomenon from their perspective and realizing how vastly different it could be, and questioning on either side, well, are we really, if I didn't know this about my friend, if I didn't know my friend thought this, experienced this, said these kinds of things, then are we really friends? And so the friendship can get tested. And it's not to say that for instance, our friendship hasn't been tested, because it has, but it's the willingness to pursue the relationship, the friendship, and deal with the issues of racism and white supremacy in tandem with one another, not apart from one another, not choosing to say, well, that's clearly something that we can't talk about because it might mess up our friendship. But instead saying, this is something that we get to talk about and we know how to talk about, and we are willing to struggle through, both for the sake of the friendship and because we're interested in being anti-racist in our walk in the world.
Sometimes examples from history can help us reflect on our contemporary setting. And I've been reflecting a lot on the experience of Vincent Harding in the Mennonite community. So Vincent Harding was an employee of Mennonite Central Committee and a former associate pastor of Woodlawn Mennonite Church in Chicago. He and his partner Rosemary founded the Menno House in Atlanta, Georgia in the early 60s. was not only an important place for white folks and Black folks to gather in the midst of the Black freedom struggle that was then rising to the surface in incredible ways at that period, but also was a support place for groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin King, Coretta King around the corner from where they were. I'm doing a lot of research into his life right now, and what keeps cropping up in the historical record is how many white leaders kept referring to Harding and Rosemary as their friends. And as I'm sort of tabulating this, I'm thinking, damn, they had a lot of, whoops, I'm not supposed to swear here, sorry. Darn it, they had a lot of friends and a lot of white friends. How many white friends did they have? And something wasn't quite making sense to me till I ran across the interview that he had done with Joanna Shank, former leader in the Mennonite Church, in which he reflects back on that experience and says, you know, during those years, we were a lot of people's favorite, and then he used the period language for a Black person at that time. We were the favorite Black person for them. Mm-hmm. And he said, I think what was going on, and here I'm paraphrasing his comment, he said, I think they were happy to have us be their Black friend and the friend of the church. But once we started talking about the racism in our own community, then that friendship doesn't become quite so exciting. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the very dynamic we're trying to explore here, is to get past the sense of using someone, whether it's a Black person or a brown person, as a white person, to be able to claim that friendship, to say there's work we have to do. And that's the point. The friendship supports us in that work. But again, it's not the point of the work.
Right.
You also talk about, you talk a lot about the church. And as I was preparing for tonight's webinar, I was thinking about my own church. I was thinking about the larger Mennonite church. And you talk about how a church committed to anti-racism must equip itself by recalling stories of racialization and talk about what that means. Unpack that a little bit for us tonight. What are the questions that churches should be exploring together to help them start recalling those stories?
Do you want me to jump in on this one, Regina, or do you want to start?
I can say a couple of things. And
sure.
Then,
yeah.
I think in terms of a question that I often ask in the classroom at the beginning of a semester, if race is the class or a big part of the class, and we have done this in other settings as well, but even having people individually ponder the question for themselves, when did you realize you had a race? When did you realize you had a race? Like, what does that question even mean for you? And what's unpacking that question a little bit, it's like, what were you told about your racial group? What were the messages that were implicit and explicit that you got from your household, your neighborhood, your school, and your church? Was it even talked about at all? And having people think about that kind of question in the context of community can emerge some fascinating conversations about how absent it was to think about race, depending on where you were, and comparing and contrasting those stories if you're in a mixed group, but even if you're not in a mixed group, comparing the similarities and the differences in the stories, and then pondering what that means. And that's on an individual level, because they are individual stories, but it opens up stories too about the systems and structures that people have access to or don't have access to. So that's one way of starting to open that up and think about it.
My comments will be directed primarily to white congregations and white members of those congregations. I'm waiting for the days when it is not a point of disruption or a point of amazement that from a pulpit in a white Mennonite church, a pastor would invite their congregants to reflect on how their racial identity as a white person has affected their faith development, their spiritual formation. One of the things that I often talk about with groups when I'm having these kind of conversations is to reflect on what it means to grow up in a society as a white person where the receipt of power and privilege, which obviously is mediated by our gender identities, by our class identities, by matters of physical ability, sexual orientation, etc., but where those consistency of whiteness have mattered, that have invited in privilege into our lives, in which ways has our faith then perhaps been atrophied because we've been conditioned to rely more on the receipt of that power and privilege from the systems of racism than the receipt that God and the Spirit provide? What does that mean that we are conditioned to accept that as normal, natural, and neutral? And I think there's rich conversations to be had there. There's points of exploration to ask about that idea of spiritual atrophying. I think it's a parallel to something that W. Du Bois, African-American historian, once wrote about the psychological wages of whiteness, which are paid out to poor white folks to think of themselves as white in order to be separated from their brothers and sisters of color in the same class line. And I wonder what that means for us in the Mennonite and the Anabaptist community to reflect on some of those, that kind of receipt of privilege, not for the point of inducing guilt, but to say, okay, how does that cause us to re-examine our lenses? How does that cause us to ask questions about where we can recommit ourselves to take risks that challenge those systems of racism around us?
Mhm.
Well, I think this leads me to think a little bit about February. Here in the United States, February is Black History Month, and that's marked in different ways in our Anabaptist congregations. Some celebrate it every single Sunday, all month long, and it's a big deal. And some maybe mark it 1 week in the month, some not at all. So the same, I think, is true, I would suspect, at least for how we talk about racism in our churches too. Do we talk about it once a month, once a year, every week? You know, is it check done in a linear way, so to speak, or not? Right. So at the end of chapter 2, and then later into chapter 3, you really get into this question of how to foster this anti-racist spirituality as something that's deliberate and tended to regularly. And so, yeah, how do we do that? And that is Christian formation at its most profound level. You write that. I think those are great words for us. But unpack that for us a little bit. How do we tend to this throughout the church year? Right? You know, we do Lent at a certain time. We do Advent at a certain time. So how do we build this into our systems?
One of the things I think about, and I thank you for the memory for me of before moving to Northern Indiana, I was in Cleveland, and in the church that I attended all my life up until moving, February was a big deal. Black History Month every Sunday. And that was my normal. It was the ritual of the year. And I didn't realize how much I loved it until it wasn't part of my church year anymore. And I really lamented that for a long time, but it does speak into that formation aspect, which we are very familiar with. That is our language, the language of formation in Christian community, in religious communities. And so to your point, I think that one of the ways that we can approach it is the same way that we do for the rhythm of the year, seeking out resources and people and what are we reading and what are we talking about. And we don't have to confine it to Martin Luther King Day in January, Black History Month in February, and all of the other months that are attached to particular groups. But how can we pay attention to, as preachers, who are we reading and quoting in our sermons? I will very honestly say that I will listen and I will mentally tally who people quote in a sermon, because it matters to me. It doesn't mean that I just like throw the preacher out with the bathwater if they don't, but it says something to me about what they're paying attention to as worship leaders and preachers, guiding the congregation through the year, through a formation process that matters in the context that we are in. It doesn't make sense to me to read in the paper and hear on the radio and have conversations day after day after day after day about what's going on with race in this country and in the world, and then not talk about it at all when we're in our gathered communities on Sunday and other days that we gather.
I think the only thing I have to add is that in my observation of the white congregations I've been a part of and have had the chance to connect with the work that I do, there seem to be two extremes about how congregations have dealt with the topic. One is to deal it in the midst of crisis when prompted because there's some either national or local crisis that's forced the congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And the other is simply to accept the silence around the conversation at those points of commemoration, to just accept that, well, we don't talk about Black History Month because that's secular or somehow outside of our realm of the attention of the church. We have to find our way to decouple the conversations about race from crisis and integrate them into the life of the church, whether it's through annual cycles or otherwise. But that decoupling from crisis, I think, is the number one challenge for white congregations around this issue. Otherwise, it's very difficult to have productive conversations because it's always clouded with the specifics of whatever crisis that someone is trying to struggle with. And it's not that you shouldn't talk about it in the midst of crisis, but for most congregation, that's the only time that we have those conversations.
And how much better would those conversations be if they were sustained,
That's right,
rather than only emerging at the time of crisis?
There's actually some really good research showing that one of the big reasons that white folk don't talk about racism with any sort of fluency is because we have no practice with it.
Mm-hmm.
We prefer to talk about in colorblind terms. In the audits that we do in Wider Stand Consulting, we do focus groups, and what we've seen occurring again and again and again in these focus groups is how hard it is for white folks to respond to a question, in what way is your organization participating in racism? Just to say the word racism is a really big thing for many people in the white community. And we want to develop it to be natural, normal, and frequent that we have these conversations so we can move things forward rather than get tied up and move backwards many times.
I'm going to offer just a couple quick reminders here. We are in the middle of a conversation for those who've just joined. I'm talking here tonight with Regina Shands Stoltzfus and Tobin Shearer, and they are co-authors of the book Been in the Struggle, which was published last year by Herald Press. And you can buy Been in the Struggle directly from Herald Press, from the CommonRead bookstore in Canada, or wherever books are sold. There's a link in the chat that you can find for that. And don't forget, you can submit your questions for Regina and Tobin right into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll turn to your questions here in a little while. I'm gonna dive back in here, talking a little bit more about congregational life as well, because I think there's a lot here for us as people in the church joining tonight's webinar to think about. You write that white churches, it's time for predominantly white churches to be just as engaged in these issues as Black churches. I'm not disagreeing, but I also know that our listeners tonight want some. Okay, so give us some concrete ideas on what that means, what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a number of things it doesn't look like, or that we've observed over time aren't helpful. Things like, okay, let's then have a choir exchange, or okay, let's have a pulpit exchange, or okay, let's just have a book study. I wonder, we were just talking about this earlier, and this is something I know Regina has talked about earlier, and have additional things to say, but I wonder if one of the places white congregations can talk about is say, what is going to be our role in responding to the lack of a conversation in this country around reparations for slavery and ongoing participation in racism? What would that look like if our congregation took that question seriously and began to model a way of justice, of shalom, of jubilee that would respond to that and lead society forward rather than waiting for society to bring it to our table? That's, I think, a very fruitful conversation a congregation could have. Anything from a tithing process to, we have some models where some congregations, shifting the conversation slightly, have turned to paying rent because they're on land that had been stolen from Native communities, and so they pay rent to local Indigenous communities. That's a way that we could think about those reparations in other contexts. That, I think, gets us somewhere. Again, away from just having a relational conversation to having a conversation around justice that deals with some of these systemic and institutional issues.
Yeah, I like the creativity of those conversations, and we've seen it on the ground in various regions. One of the things that I will point out is it does what we have done traditionally with other things like paying war taxes, and some congregations, some families, some households have taken it upon themselves as a matter of conscience to not feed into the military budget because they don't believe in war as something that any of us should participate in. And it's woven into the life of the household and of the church. And so this reparations conversation would be a way of doing that as well. And I think that the leadership or the innovation of the church doing this is twofold. One, it is in our DNA to be thinking about shalom and jubilee and leveling the valleys and the mountains. And two, I personally don't think that our government here is ever going to touch that, because it's just too politically explosive for any politician that would bring it up, which is why we've never really had a national conversation about that. The pushback would be swift, and it would be hard. It would be hard. Yeah.
So much that we can unpack here tonight. Great ideas. Since we're on congregations, let's keep on that a little bit. I'm just looking here. I have 6 pages of questions for you, and I'm at the end of page 2. So, we only have 25 minutes left. So I'm trying to figure out, where I'm gonna jump next. But since we were talking a little bit about congregations, you write in the book that, and this is further in, you write about white people worrying about saying the wrong thing when it comes to race. When I'm a worship leader, I'll be honest, sometimes I worry about saying the wrong thing when it comes to race. Mm-hmm. So we're afraid to make a mistake or speak out of turn. When we're afraid to make a mistake or speak out of turn, you write, racism becomes limited to an interpersonal realm. So unpack that piece of it a little bit for us. But then also, I want to talk a little bit about appropriation with that too. So both the interpersonal realm dangers and then appropriation. I'm a worship leader, and sometimes I was leading a worship service in my congregation focused on Black History Month, the first Sunday of February. And I was, wrestling with, should I use this very nice prayer from the African-American hymnal, or should I write my own? And should we be singing only songs written by Black people? So, but what's appropriation? Anyway, I don't think I'm alone in my concerns about some of that. So talk a little bit about both appropriation and then that interpersonal realm fear thing that I think happens as we think about what to say in our congregation.
Do you want to start, Tobin? I think I talked a lot this last bit.
Sure, yeah, I can jump in. I'll pick up the appropriation thread there. When I am in conversations about cultural appropriation, the first question or the first point of inquiry usually that I suggest is most important is to follow the money. And that is, are the resources that are being used being tied back to those who have developed them, and are they being compensated for the gifts that they've given to the church through that process? Sometimes it's hard to figure that out, but I mean, purchasing a worship resource hymnal or book that's authored by the African American community, members of that community, and royalties are going back to them and using in the congregation seems appropriate to me, as long as that's acknowledged. I think there are some, wonky dynamics that can be introduced if we're seeing that as a culture without understanding sort of what does it have to be Black to be a culture? Does it have to be brown to be a culture? Leaving sort of what has happened to white people in the midst of our cultural identities. How do we bring that to the table? Because there's really important conversations to have. But if we're just saying, okay, we're going to be ethnic, or we're going to be exotic or different because we're bringing those Black voices in, because we're bringing those brown voices in, then that's a problem. But for me, is naming the source and being sure that those sources are properly compensated are sort of the two key themes that I keep returning to, and that I hear my brothers and sisters from those communities asking us to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say to the other part of your question, which is a really important, that fear of saying the wrong thing. We will say the wrong thing. All of us will say and do the wrong thing. But if we have fashioned a culture in our congregations, in our agencies, where we talk about race, we talk about other kinds of difference, and it's not shocking, or we're whispering, or we're acting like we're not supposed to be talking about it. If we normalize these conversations, then we live into the ability to know more of what we're talking about. We have more practice saying the words. It's one of the things that I talk to my students all the time. I say, we have to learn how to say the words, right? Whether we're talking about race, or whether we're talking about gender, or I'm in peace and conflict studies. So when we're moving through conflict, when we're talking about conflict, we have to do what our first caregivers told us to do, use our words. And we become more comfortable, hopefully, the more we do it and the more we hear others doing it, we are more comfortable with it, and we are more comfortable helping each other figure things out. We had a question earlier today about the names, the labels for racial categories. And that can be fraught, that can be scary. Like, what do they want to be called, right? And that's a really difficult question, because language is fluid, because there are words that evolve. There is the reclaiming of names, there is the discarding of names. And so I feel like we will never get the answer to the question of what should we call. And I have become comfortable in saying, ask me, and I will ask you, and we will figure it out from there. And know that we will make mistakes, or know that maybe we're not necessarily making a mistake, but we are using language that someone in that group, that we think is in that group, wouldn't use. That's okay. They might get mad at us and yell at us, or they might come up to us and say, by the way, I really don't use that language for myself. And we do that with words all the time because of the way that language works. And so being comfortable using our words in all kinds of ways, and normalizing conversations that many of us may have been socialized that nice people don't talk about those things, or we don't talk about those things because it just gets everybody all upset. Well, we get upset about it because we don't know what we're doing, and we have to live into it and move into it.
And then I'll just add on to that there is a history of racialized naming in which the biggest streams have been that communities of color have been labeled by the white community and have had their names stripped from them collectively and individually. Whereas in the white community, the biggest historical stream is that we're a community in terms of our race that we have not had to speak our name as a race because it's been invisible, it's been made invisible and neutral. So it is no wonder then that we would see more volatility and change within the group from whom their names have been stripped or have had their names foisted upon them versus the community that have rarely had to speak their name as a racialized community. So there are different historical processes going on here. And again, we have to be aware of that as we enter this conversation about the language and the labels that are used in an ongoing, fluid, and active conversation.
Mhm.
I'm going to turn to a couple questions here from the audience. We have some here. Knowing that Dr. Vincent Harding left the Mennonite Church out of frustration that white leaders weren't supportive of actively joining the nonviolent civil rights movement, this person is wondering if you think a lamentation about this by Mennonite Church USA would be appropriate at this point in our common life.
Mhm.
That's an interesting question. So I'll speak to it here. I'm in the midst of writing a biography about Harding right now. So he is front in my mind every day. I wonder what he would think about that. He circled around back and had connections with Mennonites later on in his life, but he was never an active participant from that point forward, would respond positively to Mennonite requests for speaking here and there. I get nervous about laments at times because they can become very neat and then they're just sort of wrapped off in a bow and that's done. At the same time, I recognize in the book, we call for authentic grieving, and I don't know that we use the language of lamenting, but definitely within that school. I think something broader we are in need of much more broader than the specific experience of Dr. Harding alone. I was invited to speak to Mennonite Central Committee a couple months ago now. And one of the questions I had for them was about the need for a reckoning in that institution vis-a-vis their history of racism. And I sort of spelled out this history of having, again, been caught in this crisis cycle where they talk about racism for a little bit during a crisis when they're forced to it and they let it go. And we can trace that over and over again. And there's, to a degree, up to a certain point, that same pattern in the Mennonite Church USA and its predecessors. It's not quite the striking parallel we see in Mennonite Central Committee, but I think there is we're at a point of needing to have a reckoning. And I'm not ready to sort of say what that reckoning should look like. I think that needs to come from communities of color, but I think that the reckoning needs to happen is clear. What do you think, Regina?
As I'm listening to you, it again gives me tells me about the necessity of these conversations, of talking about our current reality, talking about the history that we have inherited as a natural and normal part of our church life, in the way, for instance, that many of our congregations and church groups talk about climate change, right? We talk about it as something that is harmful, that is something that we could learn more about, that something that we can take action on. And it seems to me that thinking about race and racism and moving into being more consciously anti-racist, that's another area that we could own as faith communities, because it is a danger to ourselves, our descendants, for our ancestors, and for the earth itself. Racism is not good for any of creation. And so normalizing, talking about it and thinking about it corporately in our communities, rather than an individual thing. Well, I don't say the bad words and I didn't live in the time when those things were happening, so it's not really anything that I need to be concerned about. Really just normalizing, yes, this is something as a faith community that we think about and talk about with each other on a regular basis.
Thank you.
Here's another question from a reader I think fits right into this. What is your, not a reader, someone in the webinar, clearly used to being a book editor here. What is your vision of the future of the Christian church, given the changing racial demography of our country? Do you envision more integration in churches if there's a commitment to dismantling racism? Particularly in predominantly white Christian churches.
Could you say the last part of the question again?
Yeah, so her second sentence is, do you envision more integration in churches if there is a commitment to dismantling racism in the predominantly white Christian churches?
Yeah, I think that if the second part of the sentence, I think the possibilities are wider for that. I don't personally necessarily see it as something that must happen. Our churches have become segregated for lots of reasons, intentionally so, right? There's a lot of bad theology that went into why we historically have not worshiped together, but it's also a byproduct of where we live and the neighborhoods that we live in, although do people really go to neighborhood churches anymore? I don't know. I think a lot of us drive somewhere. For me, that is a lovely thing, having been nurtured in an interracial congregation. I am all for it, but I would rather congregations do the work of the things that we've been talking about, of exploring and normalizing conversations. And if a byproduct of that work is more integrated congregations, then yay. But you can be an anti-racist congregation without being an integrated one.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to talk about here. I mean, just to build on some of Regina's comments, Catherine Dvorak, a historian, notes that most of the particular denominations of the Methodist and the Baptist Church were resegregated after the end of the period of enslavement, because African American folk who had been forced to be in white-led congregations created spaces that were their own. Mm-hmm. And so particularly in the history of the Black church, that's sacred space that has been led by and nurtured the Black community, and they held so many roles in addition to religious roles, political, cultural spaces, really treasured space. So when I am approached with this question by white congregations, just echoing what Regina said, I say it's a question to ask how you become integrated. The question is, how do you become more anti-racist? Then the example, the parallel I use sometimes is, in Nazi Germany, the confessing church made it as part of their identity that they were going to turn their face to the problem of Nazi Nazi racism and anti-Semitism, and that was going to be part of their identity. And what would it mean for white churches to turn their faces toward the problem of racism rather than away from it and say, this is going to be part of who we are. We're going to struggle with all our being and our resources to oppose that, particularly in a country now where we're seeing once again a resurgence of overt white supremacy, let alone the more subtle forms of institutional racism all around us. It's a really important time for white congregations to be speaking up and saying that's just going to be part of who we are.
I want to take another question here that takes us to our youngest in our congregations too. How do we start teaching our youngest, our preschoolers, our elementary ages, not just anti-racism, but the person is asking here, an anti-racist spirituality? How do we begin this framework when formal faith formation starts? I think that's a great question.
I think that there have been attempts to do that, and what it has turned into is the narrative of colorblindness. I know that I have come to understand that for a lot of people, the lessons that they were taught at home and at church about being colorblind come from a place of believing that is part of the solution of the problem. And so I would say that for adults, for the adults who are nurturing our littles, our babies and our children, whether we're parents, other caregivers, teachers, Sunday school teachers, that we think about how to age appropriately talk honestly to children about the harms that can come from people who hurt one another because of who they are. I think that I think that it is possible to be honest with children, again, in an age appropriate way, of why we care so much about this. And it doesn't negate the lessons that we say about being kind to one another and being friendly and all of that. But I think that they also need to begin to understand the harm that has come to children because of who they are. And I'm talking about all parts of the racial equation. I think that tremendous harm has been done to white people because of racism, because of some of the things that Tobin said earlier about depending upon whiteness rather than depending upon God for things in life. And so one of the things that people may have seen going around on social media this last while, as a response to the voices that would say we should not have children thinking about this, and we don't want children to feel bad about this. If children had to experience this, then I think that it's important for children to know that, and to know that there are other ways of approaching life. There are other ways of being. And there are age-appropriate books that are out there that begin to teach children about racism and other isms. We need to buy those books. We need to support the authors and the speakers that are putting those resources out there, and create more. If we want to have our own, then we need to create those as well.
And the stories that emerge from the struggle against racism involving children are often faith stories.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's the stories of the children and youth who participated in the 1963 Birmingham Children's March, they were based out of churches. And the argument that the children used in order to be able to be included was that they were members of their congregations, participants. And if they could do that, why can't they march in the streets? Or the story of Ruby Bridges in New Orleans integrating the church. Robert Coles, the white psychologist who was sent down to support her, noticed one day that she stopped and faced the angry crowd that were saying these horribly negative things to her, and then comes into the school. And he then asks her, why did you stop in front of them? And she said, well, I always pray the Lord's Prayer for them every day before I go through that phalanx of people, and I forgot to do that. So I stopped to pray for them then. And then he asks her, well, why would you do that? And she turns to him and says, don't you think they needed praying for? These are the stories of children who are moving us to a conversation about the fundamental issues of power, privilege, and hierarchy, not just, as Regina said, these issues of multiculturalism. That hasn't gotten us where we need to go. But those stories of children that we have with us from our history and our contemporary reality are often folded into their faith experience, and we need to share them with our youth.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Are there any particular, that I know the person who asked that question, and I know she's a librarian. And so do you have any books for kids that you would especially recommend? I mean, there's the story of Ruby Bridges, right? That's been retold for kids. There's a children's book on the Children's March as well. Right. So a couple of examples there, but do you have other books for kids that you'd recommend for Jenny to add to her library?
Are you going to go up and grab your books like you did this morning, Regina, or do you have them right there?
So we did have a conversation earlier today where we got a similar question. And all of the books that I have, they're still right next to me here. They are books that we read to our children when they were small, and they're all like in their 30s now. So there's newer stuff out there, but I will hold up this one because Ruby D signed it for me, and I took it back from my kids so that I have it forever. But yeah, this is not necessarily about racism. It's a retelling of an African folktale, but one that this little book. You know, there are other books like this, The Skin I'm In, that takes it down to a child's level to talk about difference and to talk about friendship and talking about things we do when we're friends and things that we don't do when we're friends. And it names racism. It doesn't shy away from the R word, right? And I think that as adults, and particularly as adults who nurture children and care about their well-being, including their emotional and psychological well-being, it can be scary to think about teaching children about racism. But please remember, there are children who experience racism, and yeah, and I don't want that. So I think our kids I think there are ways that we can talk to our children about hard things in the world that help them and help us help them be people who want to craft a different world.
At the very end of the book, you write that part of an anti-racist spirituality is asking, what is going to give me life right now? And what is not going to give me life right now? And about 100 pages before that, Regina, in her words, writes, if there is not joy, you're not going to keep doing it. So we just have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to end with joy. So what brings both of you joy in this work, and what is life-giving to you in this ongoing work that you've been working at for 30 years?
Yeah. I am being very genuine at the risk of sounding trite, but some of my closest relationships, friendships, that are built on trust, that are built on the knowledge that we can say hard things to each other, and the knowledge that we can just hang out and not even talk about racism for like an hour. That is a joy to me, knowing, being known, right? It's a very human desire that I think we all have. And there's something about what racism has done to us that I think disallows us from being known in ways that we need, right? And so some of my joy comes from knowing that I have those kinds of relationships, knowing that I have people that get me, and in all of the ways that I am frail, and in all of the ways that I may have some measure of whatever the opposite of frailty is, power, strength. But I can be my real, authentic, flawed self with people who are also concerned about things that I am really concerned about. That is a real joy to me.
I echo much of what Regina said, and maybe just give examples of how that's fleshed out for me. Within the Native American community, teasing is very important, as I have learned. And I particularly learned that it's been an incredible gift to be teased a lot. Within our wider stand community, there's 3 Native American women who I'm working on teams right now. I'd say a good 20 minutes of our first conversations are teasing of one kind or the other, which is an incredible gift to be receiving on a regular basis. It's also those points of trauma is too strong of a word, but intensity in our work that the joy comes because I know the people who have my back and have had my back, and I have had theirs again and again over time. So 2 weeks ago, I was in the middle of a controversy here in Montana around a contract that we were entering into with the county government that was getting all kinds of publicity, and I was getting harassment for it. And Regina writes to me, "Are you taking care of yourself? And it's your turn." It's not always my turn to be on that front line. It was my turn this time. And I got through that because of that kind of reaching out. Just last night, another close colleague of ours, Rick Dirksen, calls me up and we have a conversation for something that he's facing, and I have his back in that setting. Our boys talk about, who are now in their late 20s and early 30s, but they talk about having been grown up and nurtured not only in an interracial congregation on the south side of Chicago, but also when we would have gatherings of our Damascus Road community at that point, where we did nothing but hang out with each other and eat food. And that's still ongoing, what we do together. Our colleague Conrad Moore and his family were here in Montana to do a training with city leaders with me. And that's a big part of what we did when we weren't in the room. We're building that relationship, we're nurturing it, we're fostering it. And that's all about joy.
Joy in the struggle. Those are great, great words.
Yeah.
Tobin and Regina, we thank you both so much for participating in this conversation tonight. We really appreciate your time and your insights. I encourage everyone who has been watching tonight to go pick up a copy of Been in the Struggle. Copies are available directly, again, from Herald Press and wherever books are sold. So we want to just thank you all so much for joining us. Regina, Tobin, for your powerful words tonight. We'll leave here with that. If you're here live tonight, you will get a link to the recording of this webinar in your email later this week. And we at Menno Media will also be promoting it on our social media channels, so you can find it there. Until next time, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.